is a session on strategies to address job security and economic inequality. And of course, I think we all agree that human security forms the bedrock of peaceful and stable societies. And if we wanted to break down human security, usually we do so following UN recommendations to economic security, that is freedom from poverty and access to sustainable livelihoods, which again is a function of the ability to be employed, to be in the labor force of your country and your region. The second element of human security is food security, that is access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. Again, a function of income, which is a function of employment. Health security, access to healthcare, protection from disease outbreaks, and overall well-being, again, a function of employment and social security contributions, where partly healthcare or fully is provided by the public sector or a combination of public and private sector. The fourth element of human security is environmental security, that is protection from environmental degradation, pollution, natural disasters. And if it's taken as an insurance or if it's taken as privately bought and paid, or if it's guaranteed through tax contributions, again, environmental security is a function of employment and income raised through employment. Personal security, protection for violence, crime, and physical harm. Again, these are usually social provisions that are supported by social welfare, that is supported mostly by taxes that create fiscal spaces for investments in these areas, and again, a function of employment. Community security, protection from ethnic tensions, violence, loss of traditional cultures and values, and political security, civil rights and political rights, protection, freedom from political oppression, access to justice. Again, we are talking about public institutions that are supported through contributions from employees' income through taxes. So the way we define human security, and some of us might have added additional elements to this already holistic enough presentation of the 7 different aspects of human security. It's a provision, it's a characteristic, it's an element of our life, a very crucial element of our life, that is financed by mostly public finance, but also private finance. And all of these are directly or indirectly related to employment. So our session today will try to understand what are the risks and challenges with regards to employment and SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal 8, in our times? How can we ensure equitable income distribution, reducing inequality through full and productive employment? And there are different elements to this. My research group, which we call ourselves Alliance of Excellence for Research and Innovation on IFORIA, has launched a study that showcases that the sustainability transition that we need to engage with in order to protect human security, all these 7 different aspects of human security, is a transition that has major impacts on the required skills and occupations of the labor force. Our study showed that 85% of the skills and occupations that are needed in Europe in order to implement the European Green Deal, which is the transposition, the European transposition of the Sustainable Development Goals into a policy framework, 85% of the skills and occupations are currently not in the labor market of Europe. And further studies where we try to extend this research before Europe showcase that the percentage of missing skills and occupations for the green and digital transition is even bigger beyond Europe. The other element that is also crucial, at least in my mind, is the fact that we know that we are facing increasing populations in some areas, and that research demonstrates that social, economic, political, and environmental costs of unemployment, and especially unemployment of the young in these areas where population is increasing, outweigh the cost of generating sufficient employment opportunities. And in other areas of the world, like in OECD countries, we know that we are facing aging populations that threaten the very engine of economic growth and poses challenges to living standards and social cohesion, and actually point to shortages of workers. So in these countries, we are facing shortages, not of jobs, but of workers. These are the issues that I think are big challenges. And I want to move to our panelists and ask, starting with Grigoris ZAROTIADIS, Professor of Economics at the Aristotelian University of Thessaloniki, and just voted as a new member of the World Academy of Arts and Science with a very rich CV, and hence his membership in our academy. We are very thrilled about this result. I wanted to give Grigoris the floor and ask how realistic he thinks a reduction in working hours, how realistic this possible measure is in different places that is being discussed, and how it can be imposed given internationalized competition. Grigoris, the floor is yours.
Special thanks, Phoebe, and special thanks for the extremely honoring allowance to be member of WAAS, and I'm looking forward to contribute with all of you to the future steps and initiatives of the Academy. The question is actually pointing exactly to the center of the question, for my understanding at least, and allow me to present, if it's possible. I prepared only 4 different slides just to help myself contribute to the discussion in as short as possible duration. So I will not move into the presentation mode, just going around the slides in that way, and I think that in that way it's more easy to be shown to you. Before we go to the feasibility question of the decrease of the necessary decrease in working time, let us see why this is a necessary step. And just put some figures in the first slide, trying to argue that there is a strong technology advancement, as we all know, which, however, has a very strong effect also in labor productivity. There are three main ways in approaching labor productivity: aggregate labor productivity, real GDP per labor hours worked. And we can see that this, since the Second World War, in the most modest estimation, is more than 5 times higher in our times. Total factor productivity, it's a different way to approach it, as the real GDP produced per aggregate input, including capital input as well, is almost doubled in the same period. And also the third, for me, the most general, but also the most obvious way to understand it is the fact that the GDP per capita in PPP measured is more than 4 times what we used to have in the 60s. Additionally, we can put in our discussion the argument that not only the actual appearing productivity has grown substantially in the last decades, but also the potential productivity is even stronger, rising above the actual productivity measures. It is because of an increase in the velocity of technical change, which has not been yet introduced in the productive activities, but also due to the deepening of socioeconomic deficiencies, which hold us back from the possibility to adapt and to utilize the technological advancements. Now, at the same time, this was one picture, the one point of view, the one side of the argumentation, but on the same time, we have the reality in working conditions and labor relations, which is completely different. We have more than a century since the generalization of the 8 hours day and 40 hours week. Instead of discussing, the discussion is already in place, but instead of moving towards a lowering of working time, we have the opposite development. We have an indirect increase of average daily and weekly working duration. And also we have a strong intensification of labor. And the funny thing is that this is partly happening through the exploitation of new technology, which should be actually the opposite. I mean, the exploitation of new technology should go towards the lowering of working load. And at the same time, we are witnessing the fact that average real wages are stagnating. And even more, especially in the European Union space, if we measure it as a ratio of GDP per capita, are decreasing in the last decades. Having in mind these two pictures, that on the one hand, productivity is strongly and exponentially rising, and on the other, the intensity of or the intensification of workload is being strengthened, and also at the same time we are lagging behind with respect to the need of lowering working time. I think that a response to the question that you said about human security in the general sense in your introductory words should be to move towards the sufficient reduction of working time along with justifiable increase of real wages. And this is not only a matter of an ethical meant justice, it is also a matter of economic efficiency, in the sense that if we do not succeed to redistribute the technological surplus and the oligopoly super profits, then we will not be able to counteract the trap of overproduction, which, according to my understanding, is what's happening in the world markets today. At the same time, moving into this direction is a necessity for socio-political balance and also for global human security, in the sense that you introduced it in your words in the beginning. Now, moving on directly to the question that you raised, I think that it is truly not so easy today compared to the situation 1 century ago to go into a generalization of reduction of working time, simply because there is the first movement problem. I mean, there is, because of the intensified globalization and competition in global markets, those who will react first and go into a reduction of working time will suffer from, at least in the beginning, from sufficient lack of competitiveness. Therefore, the only possibility to go into a historically well-justified and economically very needed reduction of working time is to do it in a combined way globally, or at least within the areas where economic collaboration is stronger and can make these things possible, like, for instance, the European Union. At the same time, I think that it is a possibility to move into such a big structural change by starting from the industries and from the branches of the economy where the concentration of capital, the existence of big production units is present, and there this can be applied in an easier way and in a more efficient way. So just to finalize my contribution in that sense, I think that we live in a period where social and technological evolution precedes the institutional and political ones. We live in a period where objective historical developments meet subjective social choice and vice versa. So we have to make a social choice. And in that sense, moving into the direction that I propose, I think it is helping us to understand that either we shape history or we suffer the lack of progress. I hope that we will do the first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grigoris. And it's always at the back of my mind whether we have the capacity to synchronize with the continuous and increasing pace of technological advancement and other advancements, not just AI, not just new technologies, in terms of renewables and circular economy and digitalization, but each and every aspect of our job description is being constantly updated and upgraded at a pace that I am wondering whether we have the capacity to keep up with, we as humans, whether we have the capacity to upskill and reskill at that pace mentally, but also whether we have the investment capacity in terms of time and money to do that. It's a synchronization challenge, and not only that, at least. Do you?
If you allow me, yeah, I completely agree. And it was always a problem to be synchronized in socioeconomic terms with the technological advancements. In our days, this is even more difficult because the velocity of technological development is rising exponentially. And I mean, what I'm oftenly saying is that previously it was the case that a technological generation was lasting much more than one or two biological generations. Today is completely the opposite, and this makes things even more difficult.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Grigoris. Our next speaker is Randall WRAY, Professor of Economics at Pratt College and Senior Scholar at Levy Economics Institute. A very rich CV, and I'm sure we can all find that CV on the website, but we are all impatiently waiting to hear his view about the questions that have been raised in this session. And in particular, a question that I find very intriguing: can a nation really afford to provide a good job to everyone who wants to work? Randall, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm also going to share.
Of course.
And what I'm going to do before I answer that question is very quickly go through an overview of what the Job Guarantee Program is. And really, I'm addressing many of the same questions that we just went through. This paper began right after a 2017 report by the ILO. And it examined rising joblessness around the world in the context of relatively good growth. This is before COVID, obviously. So the problem was that we're not creating enough jobs. There are short-run reasons for this and long-run reasons. In the short run, recession, slow growth, downturns, and inappropriate policies can generate unemployment. In the long run, what we have is demand gaps, structural unemployment, and jobless growth, which was the subject of that ILO report. We know that the costs of unemployment are very large. I'm an economist. We usually look at the lost output as one of those costs, but the social costs are even larger than the economic costs. The benefits of full employment. Again, economists will focus on the goods and services that can be produced, but there are many other positive benefits of sustained full employment, including on-the-job training. This is one answer to the question of skills development, and poverty alleviation, community building, and so on. And we know from the work of SEN, there are multipliers, there are positive feedbacks that reinforce so that the total is greater than the sum of the parts. Okay, what is a job guarantee? It's an alternative to what Marx called the reserve army of the unemployed. It is an employed buffer stock of labor. What we advocate is a public job at a base wage, which should be a living wage. At least that's what we should work toward. It maintains continuous full employment. It resolves both the short-term and long-term unemployment problems. Obviously, it doesn't replace all labor force programs. We will still need other things such as skills training for particular kinds of work. It provides an inbuilt inflation control mechanism. It can ensure full employment with price stability. Spending on the program is countercyclically automatically. Government spending on the program will go up when the private sector downsizes. It will go down as the private sector recovers. It ensures that people can continue to work even in recessions, so it helps to stabilize wage income and thus consumption. It provides a framework to reduce hiring costs for the private sector because the private sector can always recruit out of the job guarantee program when the private sector is growing, and it can provide on-the-job training. The traditional economic response to unemployment is to try to grow the economy faster. But what we've seen since the 1960s is that growth by itself is not an appropriate goal. It doesn't create enough jobs. I know in the case of the United States that economic booms actually increase inequality. In the 60s, we used to say a rising tide raises all boats. It does not. It increases inequality. It can harm the environment, and it can create instability. So full employment with a job guarantee promotes shared prosperity. We can purposely aim at environmental sustainability, and we can get growth with price and currency stability. So back in 2019, we did a simulation using the FAIR model, and we assumed a $15 an hour wage in the program. Today, it would be higher than that. Medicare for all, childcare, paid vacation, parental leave, and so on. And I won't go through the kinds of jobs that we simulated. The projects would be put forward by communities and be evaluated on the basis of the value to the community, to the participants, the likelihood of success, and the contribution to preparing workers for non-program employment. A key point is that it takes workers as they are. It doesn't say, go get education first, then we will hire you. You take them as they are, where they are, so the jobs are created in every community. The main findings using the FAIR model with a 2-year phase-in were that, again, this is before COVID, before the deep recession, the job guarantee employment would have peaked in the United States at 15 million people. It would have generated an additional 4 million jobs in the private sector. We found that about 5 million workers would come out of all three of the main categories, from the unemployed, from the already employed, because some firms would shut down if they had to compete with $15 an hour, and from out of the labor force. The boost to the real GDP is almost $500 billion. Everyone is always worried about inflation. What would happen if you had full employment? Wouldn't it cause inflation? No, actually it does not. The peak inflation increase was 0.74 percentage points, and by the end of the period that we analyzed, it would have been insignificant. Federal government spending does increase on the program, but tax revenue also goes up. So what we found was that the budget deficit would increase by about $400 billion a year, or about 1.5% of GDP. State budgets would actually improve because higher employment leads to greater tax revenue at the state level. And we did not take into account all of the estimated cost savings that would come from full employment, lower welfare spending, less crime, less spending on prisons, and so on. So we didn't take that into account. I think that once you take all of that into account, Phil Harvey estimates that actually the net cost to the federal government would be zero. Okay, and let me just conclude with my favorite quote from Keynes. The conservative belief there's some law of nature which prevents people from being employed, that it's rash to employ people, is the sort of thing which no man could believe who had not had his head filled with nonsense for years and years. With that, I will quit. And rather than asking, can we afford the program? The question should be, can we afford not to have full employment? The costs of not having full employment are much greater than the costs of having full employment. And I'm happy to go into why governments with sovereign currency can always afford to employ their own population. With that, I will quit. And I think.
Thank you so much.
I think I've forgotten how to stop. Oh, there, stop share. It's been a while since I used Zoom.
So what about the countries that really cannot afford it, the developing country? Is it about depending on multilateral aid to actually create those conditions? Because on the arguments on full employment in countries that are developed, I would agree with you fully. What about countries that are yet to have the institutional robustness and the private sector structure that will provide that potential? How do we build that?
Yes. If a country issues its own currency, then it can always spend its own currency to hire unemployed resources. Now, there could be questions about whether that's going to have an impact on the exchange rate. So this is a big issue for developing countries, and I recognize that. What you need to do is try to minimize the impacts on your trade balance. And so, for example, in Argentina, during their crisis, they implemented a JEFES program, which we went down and studied. And one thing that they did was to put people in the program to work producing food. And this will reduce the imports of food And they used in-kind payments in addition to actually very low wages, so that people were receiving benefits from the program not in the form of currency. So they could not increase purchases of imports. Instead, they were being supplied with output from Argentina. So I think that's one idea that helps to reduce the possible impacts on imports. And then just finally, one other thing that they do need to worry about. If you're providing wages in your domestic currency, then you also can afford to purchase domestic output, which could lead to inflation. So these are the two things you need to worry about: possible domestic inflation and possible impacts on your exchange rate because of imports. So what you want to do is to ensure that the jobs you're creating help to address those two issues. So import substitution, for example, is the classic recipe for developing countries.
Thank you so much. Very clear. Our next speaker is Azita BERAR-AWAD, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing the surname correctly, so excuse me for that. So Azita is chair of United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. She was former ILO senior director and director of policy at GLO, founder of the Global Policy Research Network on Youth Transitions, and so many other things. And I'm eager to ask her whether she thinks technology is determining the future of work. And also showcase that through the lens of her own expertise, as I will allow her to introduce her own expertise. Please.
Thank you, Phoebe, and greetings to co-panelists and to the audience. Thank you for having me on this panel. Actually, I have been director of the Employment Policy Department of ILO for not less than maybe 15, 20 years, more than that in the ILO, but precisely working with different governments in coming up with comprehensive employment policies to address full productive employment. And what I have heard from my other co-panelists really sound the bells that we have been hammering all along this period. In my presentation, I will address the questions that you have put forward on technological innovations. But before doing that, I want to point to some of the mystifying associations or assertions that we hear when we are discussing full and productive employment and generally the significant gaps that we have to achieve decent work. But we agree around this panel, but we have to recognize that, as you put it very nicely in the introductory part, Phoebe, that work, humanity is very far from reaching a point where we have put it's the end of work and we can progress and flourish without work. So work is an essential dimension of human security remains, but also of social identity, of social status. And also, as you said it, as a gateway opening up other dimensions of social security. The right to work is embedded in the Human Rights Covenant on Economic, Cultural, Social Rights. The objective of full and productive employment is international law in the ILO Convention 122 on employment policy, ratified by more than 150 countries. And the decent work has been added to full and productive employment as an objective of the SDG 8. However, a recent review that was done very recently shows not only the significant gaps in attaining this goal, which looks for many groups in the society as an illusion, but also the regression that has been happening in the last 10 years in terms of youth employment, women's employment, child labor, et cetera, across several indicators. But the erosion of decent work globally, to me, is symptomatic of broader global structural issues and interact in multiple ways with wars and conflicts, climate change, rise of populism, and retracting multilateralism. We don't have time to go to the full consideration and whys and hows, but what I wanted to debunk today on 4 ideas. First of all, I want to say that the opposite of full employment is not unemployment, but low quality jobs, informality, underemployment in the form of involuntary temporary employment, 0-hour contract, etc., that have become pervasive in labor markets across the world. And they are embedded in structural economic inequalities. So we cannot understand inequality in labor markets if we do not look in terms of inequality in access, youth, women, inequality in security conditions of work. 60% of the global workforce is still producing and working in conditions of the informal economy. Inequality of wages. Grigoris mentioned that in spite of the labor productivity growth, the wages are no longer indexed. And in fact, the labor share of the overall GDP has been steadily going down. So gains of technological innovations are not translating into higher wages and are not distributed fairly. Inequality in social protection, in voice and participation, if we take the global supply chains. And the statistics abound. I don't want to tire you. So for me, we should not put the emphasis on unemployment, but on low quality jobs that our economies are providing. The second point that I want to mark is that erosion of decent work is a systemic phenomenon of the neoliberal policy agenda. It is not externalities in one area vis-a-vis the others, but we have what we have seen, and there is now a major consensus amongst most economists. What we are seeing is a disconnect between growth and jobs. I think Randall also alluded to that. We see a disconnect between growth, jobs, and welfare. And we see that when there is policy and the policy is really conceptualized across a vulnerable groups approach, how can we redress the negative impact of what's happening rather than redressing the core economic strategy that is producing these levels of inequality, insecurity, and vulnerability. The third point that I wanted to say, and that links to your question, are the new technological innovation, in particular AI, robotics, and digital technology in general, the main culprit? Is this really causing unemployment? And I want to say no, because we know that these are definitely destroying tasks, maybe not jobs, but tasks and jobs, but they are creating also other opportunities for jobs. Obviously, there is a short-term, long-term view on this. Jobs are being destroyed, not necessarily new jobs are affordable for those who are laid off. But however, this is a question of transition, which is we see in all technological innovations, but the pace may be faster. But I was last week at the AI Summit here in Geneva, a global AI summit, and the title is AI for Good. So we were putting the emphasis on AI for good opportunities. However, it was important to highlight the fear of losing control, the lack of the void of regulations, of governance. And if we look at the digital labor platforms, the issue of algorithmic management that is creating a lot of havoc. The idea that we are creating a labor market voice of the regulations that have been over the years developed to regulate the labor market physically. So we are talking about virtual labor migration, we are talking about, and a complete void of governance, which are being obviously addressed. So the main worry there wasn't job destruction necessarily. That is a concern, I'm not saying, but it was more lack of ethics and lack of governance rules. The fourth idea that I wanted to emphasize is that employment policy is often pushed back on countries as a local issue. You should get it right. But it's not quite. Many national policies matter and they can have a better design and better financing, but they are really constrained. They are shaped by the environment, the frameworks of international economic financial architecture. And I would like just to single out one example, and that is the debt trap. I don't know if you have followed the discussions on the financing for development in Sevilla conference that was taking place. It's amazing that 60 countries plus, and these are not necessarily or low-income countries, but middle-income countries, are struggling with debt servicing. Debt servicing is higher than the spending they are able to make in social infrastructure, in industrial policy, for employment generation, etc., etc. So, and the outcome of that conference, which is based on 2 years of preparatory process on ideas how we can finance transitions to environmental transition, green industrial development, as you have mentioned it also, but the outcome was very poor. And all those great ideas, there has been no commitment. So that is also where we are saying that the international framework and the resistance to change in a fairer and more inclusive environment is hampering employment policy, is hampering employment outcomes very locally. Fifth and last point is there hope in all this? And I want to think that there is. We have to search hard to see what is happening. But remember during the COVID and in the wake of COVID, we all were hopeful that humanity has realized the existential threat and we are back to a human-centered agenda, and therefore we are going to revalue the care economy, the essential workers, and the importance of full employment also as part of human security. However, that was short-lived, and we are back to trade wars, to more competition, to rising military expenditures, to diminished commitment to multilateralism and to solidarity, diminishing aid, and all that what we have seen. However, I really think that we are in a flux of moving to new paradigms. These don't happen overnight, but I think there are lots of social movements, think tanks that are coming up with innovative ideas for social engineering, and they are pushing them across it's not going to be easy. The resistance is there, but I really think that we have to have a political economy lens on the question of full employment, and the solution will come from that lens too.
Thank you very much. Very rich comments. Indeed, Seville was disappointing, but being there and participating in many sessions, one of the encouraging things, I could comment on many of the great things that you said by saying I agree. But let me just say that about Seville, because we have another very important speaker and we have 10 minutes. One message that was widespread, and it was quite common between the participants, is that US is important, multilateral aid from the US is important. We are going to continue working towards restructuring the global financial architecture with or without the US, but if the US wants to come back, we would all welcome the coming back. So it was a good way to say that the rest of us are going to continue the efforts for that have been documented in the Summit of the Future and now in Seville conference, but we really need you, US, to come back towards leadership in this multilateral space. And it was good that this was not this was the reaction and not the opposite, that we don't need you, because we need very important countries like the US. But this is, again, a very long conversation. Our next speaker is Daljeet Singh GAHLE, fusion energy consultant at the International Atomic Energy Agency, with a very strong background in data engineering and plasma physics. And he is going to share with us ways that the macro, meso, and micro ecosystem can really enable the labor market towards more equality and more job security. And my question after your description would be, is there a recent example of mainstreaming economic ideas you can give that illustrate how it is done? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Phoebe. That's kind, and I'm sure it'll stick out to people that my background is slightly different to everybody else's. But over my career, I've been involved with training and job development, both for individuals, but also teams of people across different companies, both in academia, in the civil service, and in an international context. And I sort of bump into the same problems over and over again, which is leading me to sort of this conversation we're having here. And it really connects the sort of small individual experiences people have to these bigger stories. So let me tell you a bit of a story. In 2013, I was head of data engineering at the UK Health Security Agency. So this is, if you check the weather, you see some tables, some graphs, we call it a dashboard. This is the kind of work that's involved. And as the agency was moving from an emergency response to a more business as usual approach, we needed to move from consultants to civil servants, and we needed to hire lots of people. And there was a problem of shortages of skilled workers that could hit the ground running, and a shortage of time to do lots of job training and development to take people that clearly have the potential and develop the teams that we want. So I initially thought, well, how did I do it? I did it. Why can't somebody else do it? I did a physics PhD, and in that I did research software engineering and applied statistics. It is not a scalable solution to go out in the world and say, get a physics PhD and learn how to write software, and then everybody will have a job and everything will be good. So why did I have this problem? When I talk to my peers and my colleagues, why do people have the same problems in terms of recruitment and job training? Well, in this case, in the UK public sector, the budgets have been tight for 10, 15 years. If you look at UK GDP in US dollars, it took 14 years for us to recover from the 2008 recession. So there are these big macro problems that kind of frame this issue. So briefly, is everybody broke? You look at the news, cost of living crisis, people can't afford rent, AI is taking your job. If you graduated, well, you graduated 5, 10 years too late. That's a problem you will solve somehow. But some people have money. The economy in Europe has been approximately flat for 10, 15 years. but people at the top 1%, they're getting richer. We have more billionaires than before. Approximate of $6.5 trillion has increased in billionaire wealth over 10 years. That's my country, the UK, and France's GDP put together. So there's money there. All of our activity is going somewhere. So if I briefly sort of get into solutions, so I know we're sort of short on time, this brings back sort of my messages to what everybody else has been talking about today, and that's why it fits in. I have these problems, we have these problems, society has these problems, and we just need money to fix the problems. So at a macro level, I would say just tax everybody. We need a broad, deep tax base that gets the will and public support for taxation for all of the reasons that previous speakers have mentioned, so I won't go on. At a meso, at an intermediate scale, I'd say talk to people. One thing I've definitely learned in science, and especially working on clean energy solutions for climate change, the problem isn't always there isn't a solution. Sometimes the problem is just the solution isn't implemented. So we need to talk to each other. Conferences like this, conferences that people have mentioned in this panel, but also in different media outlets, newspapers, podcasts, reach as many people as possible. And unfortunately, the only advice at a micro level I have is be overqualified and ideally have started your career 10 years ago. Because when you look at the number of applications per grad job, it's 1 to 200 in the UK. And a lot of those jobs are being taken by people who lost their job during the pandemic and are picking a job at a lower level. So in more practical terms, these micro solutions don't work on a large scale. We have to work together to implement these large scale solutions. Thank you. And I think sorry Phoebe, you asked about examples of this. I'll try and do very briefly, as it's been exciting, so we're running out of time. In the UK news over the past few weeks, there's been a lot of conversation about a wealth tax, a very specific wealth tax of 2% of income over 10 million pounds worth of wealth. So everything over that, you get taxed at 2% annually. And it's being called the Neil Kinnock wealth tax. Because he was Labour leader in the early 90s, really responsible for moving the Labour Party from the left to the centre and the mainstreaming of the party again. But when you look at the background of this idea, you've had people for a couple of years mentioning this policy over and over and over again. So before the general election, about a year before Neil Kinnock came out and publicly pushed this idea, you had the Green Party in the UK add this to their manifesto for the election. And in the preceding years before that, you had prominent economic activists such as Gary Stevenson of Gary's Economics YouTube channel. There's a whole background story to how he went from being a city trader to this sort of campaigning, that this engagement through different platforms is feeding into the political conversations and taking these solutions that all of the academics and academic body have developed the literature for, and developing the political environment where they could become implemented. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Leave your slide there. So your micro suggestion, this is an advice I always give to my children. Your meso suggestion, this is an advice I always give to my team, and it's a big research team of 250 professors and researchers. And at the macro level, tax everyone and tax the millionaires and billionaires. A wealth tax is something that I've been advocating throughout my career. So it pays to, know that between disciplines, we can agree through different thought pathways, but we can agree on the main things that need to be done. thank you very much for attending, for providing your insightful comments, all the panelists in this session. And thank you to the audience for having the patience to listen to us. Thank you.